11:05 over on Moorfor.
When the government fights terror, it should have just one purpose: the safety of the British people. This film will show how Tony Blair has used terror for his own political advantage. Even as the bodies were being pulled from the wreckage of the London bombings, the authorities were starting to spin. Remember the repeated claim that this was the work of clean skins, people unknown to the authorities? Well, it wasn't true.
There was a lot of spin on the day. That word cleanskins appeared again and again on the day. It subsequently turned out that, in fact, the 7/7 plotters were not cleanskins at all. We heard over and over again the phrase "out of the blue." It subsequently turned out that at least one of the 7/7 plotters had been under some kind of surveillance.
In this film, I will show that Tony Blair is fighting terror in the wrong way, that some government measures are less concerned with fighting terror than they are with generating newspaper headlines. I will show that Tony Blair and his ministers have not always told us the truth about terror. I will argue that the Prime Minister has converted terror into a political tool, and that is a breach of the fundamental trust that is at the heart of the pact between government and us, the people. A month after the bombings, the Prime Minister summoned the British press to Downing Street to announce his grand plan to confront extremism and terror.
Time and again over the past few weeks, I've been asked to deal firmly with those prepared to engage in such extremism.
He seized the news agenda with 12 major initiatives to tame the terrorist threat.
Let no one be in any doubt, the rules of the game are changing.
The truth is that embarrassingly little has emerged from the Prime Minister's 12 initiatives. That speech was every bit as much about combating tabloid criticisms of the long summer holiday plans of MPs as it was about combating the real terrorist menace. Here's what happened. A modest anti-terror bill was already in the pipeline. A few days after the London bombings, the Home Secretary took the extremely unusual step of inviting opposition parties to work with him to hone the new laws.
When there was a great deal of political pressure on him, his first instincts were to try and bring the political parties together to seek agreements.
Charles Clarke said, we will, as far as conceivably possible, try to do this by consensus. He may not be in those exact words, but that was the thrust of what he said.
The Home Secretary was fully in step with the mood of national unity after the bombings.
All parties are continuing to work together to put forward the right legislative programme that we have to deal with. We'll maintain contact throughout the summer and have more intensive discussions in September about the issues that we've talked about, but very constructive overall.
As Charles Clarke spoke, Britain was still coming to terms with the London bombings. Just 5 days before, there had been the second failed bombings of July the 21st. The Sun now launched a campaign demanding tough action. It was outraged that MPs dared to go on holiday at such a time. With Tony Blair himself about to head off to the sunshine home of pop celebrity Cliff Richard, Downing Street came up with a plan to silence the critics. By now, Charles Clarke and his opposition counterparts, David Davis and Mark Oaten, were all on holiday. On August the 4th, Oaten and Davis were rung up by Hazel Blears, Charles Clarke's deputy at the Home Office.
The basis of that conversation led me to believe that what the Prime Minister was going to announce was of very little political significance, that this was not a big shift, and that the consensus that we had would continue.
I got a telephone call from Hazel Blears telling me the next day the Prime Minister was going to make an announcement on their counter-terrorism proposals and that there were going to be 4 things in it. She told me 4 things.
The message, as clearly understood by both Oaten and Davis, was nothing to worry about. The Prime Minister is just going to make a little announcement. This was not true. The very next day, Tony Blair announced his 12 new initiatives. In doing so, he shredded the cross-party consensus on terror. This was the moment Tony Blair moved from fighting terror to spin.
The rules of the game are changing. New grounds for deportation and exclusion, an offence of condoning or glorifying terrorism. The detention, pre-charge of terrorist suspects be significantly extended.
The Prime Minister announcing this set of new measures put the consensus, frankly, into tatters.
A new power to order closure of a place of worship which is used as a centre for fomenting extremism.
My first thought was, the Prime Minister's taking control of this process while the Home Secretary's out of the country.
We will work to turn these sentiments into reality, and that is my duty as Prime Minister.
The people whose job it is to draft anti-terror laws, the experts in the Home Office, seem to have known nothing about Downing Street's grand plan. Journalists phoning their contacts there found the civil servants amazed that Tony Blair had muscled in.
It is my understanding it took Charles Clarke and the Home Office by surprise. And it was a deeply humiliating moment for him. He's a clever enough politician to have managed to survive that. But at the time, there is absolutely no doubt that the Home Office was unsighted.
What makes you so sure that the Home Office was unsighted?
Having spoken to people around Charles Clarke, his civil servants, this was something that, whereas Charles may have been aware of it at the very last minute, certainly the people around him were aware of it only as they watched it unfold.
The Home Secretary denies that he was out of the loop. How far in advance were you consulted about the 12-point plan?
Right through the whole process. I was on holiday in America at that time, and I was on the phone to the Prime Minister a great deal during that time, right up to the statements that he actually made. I was fully involved, fully supported it, I thought it was the right thing to do.
In that case, I cannot understand why you allowed Hazel Blears to tell David Davis and Mark Oaten that these were measures of no great importance, nothing significant, nothing that would break the consensus.
And I don't think that's an entirely accurate characterisation of what was said. I think the best way to leave it, Peter, is to say that I acknowledge that both Mark Oaten and David Davis felt, because they both said to me afterwards, that they hadn't been fully briefed on what was going to be said in the Prime Minister's statement. I understood their concern and said I was sorry if that's what they felt. I don't think that it was an accurate picture, actually. I think there was a very full briefing, but obviously the communication didn't take place as it should have done.
Even senior allies of the Prime Minister were disturbed. I went to speak to a former Home Office Minister who now chairs the influential Commons Committee that scrutinises anti-terror legislation.
The 12-point plan to some extent addressed the what you might call the something must be done agenda. All of those issues around which it's possible in a tabloid newspaper to say something should be done about these people expressing unpleasant views on our television, something should be done about people we don't like the look of. Some of the measures were not well worked out. I described them myself at the time as half-baked.
From such a senior figure, and on a subject as delicate as terror, these are devastating criticisms. John Denham is saying that last summer's speech on terrorism by the Prime Minister was in large part a piece of spin. In other words, the Prime Minister was just as focused on pursuing newspaper headlines as he was on pursuing terrorists. And that speech was just the start of a season of political point scoring over terror. By the time MPs returned from holiday, the Prime Minister's panicky 12-point plan had become the basis for a new terrorism bill. Tony Lloyd is a former law lord who was once in charge of scrutinising new laws to fight terror. He was horrified when he read the anti-terror bill. He considered much of it thoroughly bad law.
All this legislation seems to be very often a hurried attempt to meet what they see as a public demand, ill-considered, because they haven't had time to think exactly what it is they want to do.
Last month, Tony Lloyd led the defeat in the Lords of one key item taken from Tony Blair's 12-point plan, glorification of terrorism.
It is very hard to say what exactly the government has in mind by the term glorification. It's defined in the bill as including every statement which glorifies the commission of such act or offence, and is a statement, and here are the words, from which those members of the public could reasonably be expected to infer that what is being glorified as conduct that should be emulated by them in existing circumstances. Well, now, how on earth is anybody to understand that? Nobody still knows what glorification really means, and I feel sure juries will not understand it. But there it is. I hope that glorification may still be dropped, but who knows?
Another Blair proposal brought even greater controversy. Tear up habeas corpus, Britain's most fundamental civil right, and let the police detain terror suspects for 90 days without charging them for an offence.
It's a huge departure. It's completely alien to our principles of justice. And for once, one can actually say that this goes back to Magna Carta. I think it's Article 39 of Magna Carta specifically says that the king cannot lock people up unless they are being put through a process of law or have been judged.
The move was so momentous that even the Home Secretary seemed nervous. Throughout last autumn, he put it on record to the opposition parties that there was room for negotiation. Just 48 hours before the Commons vote on the proposal, Clarke was still talking of compromise.
When I went to see Charles Clarke on the morning of the 7th of November, we explained that we had grave reservations. He told us at the meeting that he was going to go away and think about that, and indeed afterwards, outside the Home Office, Charles Clarke expressly said that he was going to try and find a compromise over the period of detention.
Later today, I will be tabling an amendment to reduce the amount of time from 90 days, but not as low as 28 days.
Only an hour after Charles Clarke made that unequivocal commitment, he was humiliated. Tony Blair announced that he wouldn't budge from the full 90 days the police had asked for.
I believe that they have put forward a compelling case, making it crystal clear that the need for a maximum of 90 days to hold suspects prior to charge is necessary.
That night in Parliament, Tony Blair held a private meeting with Labour MPs to convince them. But he did not justify the legislation because it would defeat terror. He sold it as a matter of raw political calculation.
The Prime Minister's case throughout was that Labour backbenchers who did not support the bill would be seen to be soft on terrorism, that if there was a further atrocity, then they might be held responsible. And in the Prime Minister's words, they would be held to have abetted terrorism.
So the Prime Minister was telling you that if you didn't vote for 90 days and there was another atrocity, there would be a political price to be paid.
He wasn't only telling us, he was yes, passionately berating us that this was very important for the next election and the credibility of the government. They were all political points, perfectly valid political points, but this was not a matter of electoral politics, which is how he presented it. This is a matter of getting the right decision on a very important piece of legislation, and I think that we would have done better to have heard quietly from the Prime Minister about why he believed that 90 days was important. We never heard that case put at all.
It was all about political spin, as the Home Secretary meanwhile demonstrated. A questionnaire in his name was emailed to Labour Party members. If they could be shown to support 90 days, it would add pressure on rebel MPs. But the questions were so loaded that Charles Clarke later had to apologise for them. Do you think police should have the time and opportunity to complete their investigations into suspected terrorists? Do you think the government should make sure there are new safeguards to protect innocent people? None of this did any good.
The ayes to the right, 291. The noes to the left, 322.
The 90 days motion was defeated. Tony Blair, supported by the police, had told us that 90 days was vital to defeat terrorism. They were not believed. Downing Street's spin had destroyed trust. It was a pivotal moment in British public life.
The truth is surely that both on the Monday the 7th of November and earlier on the 12-point plan, you were just rolled over by Downing Street, weren't you?
It's completely untrue. That allegation was widely made, and I know it fits into the preoccupations of certain journalists, yourself included, that everything is run by the Prime Minister full stop and all cabinet members are simply puppets who do his bidding. But that is in fact not the case. That is not how government operates under this government, nor I suspect under any other government, even with strong leaders such as Margaret Thatcher.
The strongest criticisms of the anti-terror bill were largely directed at the measures in it which were taken from the Prime Minister's 12-point plan.
Of these 12 points, 2 have not been heard of since, 1 was already law, 2 have since been dropped, 4 have run into trouble, and just 3 seem to be on course. The Prime Minister defined his 12-point plan as a comprehensive framework for dealing with the terrorist threat. It could just as readily be described as a rather sketchy, short-termist presentational device.
Let's have a look at another short-term presentational device. Tony Blair is proud that he incorporated the European Convention on Human Rights into British law. But when it comes to terrorism, he's responded to public pressure with headline-grabbing measures, even when he's been warned that they'll fall foul of his own human rights law. The thinking works like this: pass new laws to look tough and blame the judges if they're thrown out. That way the judges carry the can for being soft on terror, while Tony Blair still looks good. The Prime Minister tried this trick early in his premiership. Amongst court papers concerning the proposed extradition of 4 Egyptians, we found Downing Street memos that reveal the Prime Minister's thinking. He was warned that the extradition might well be blocked in the courts on the grounds that the Egyptians could be maltreated when they returned to their native country. It's the Prime Minister's response, as cited in a memo by his private secretary, which is so extremely revealing. The Prime Minister believes that we should take our chance in the courts. It then goes on to say that if the courts rule against us, then at least it will be the courts and not the government who would be responsible for releasing the 4 men from detention. In other words, the Prime Minister's just as interested in being seen to act tough as he is in actually achieving a workable and enduring solution. This tactic was repeated after 9/11. Tony Blair brought in a high-profile law so that foreigners said to pose a threat could be locked up in Belmarsh prison. He was warned all along that this law was illegal.
The European Human Rights Commissioner expressed grave doubts about the detention aspect of the 2001 Act. So did the Newton Committee, which was set up to keep watch over that particular Act, the workings of that Act. They expressed grave concern, but the government paid no notice.
The law lords duly ruled these detention orders did breach our human rights obligations. One of them, Lord Scott, judged that such indefinite imprisonment is the stuff of nightmares associated with Soviet Russia in the Stalinist era. To replace detention orders, the government cobbled together a form of indefinite house arrest. When opposition parties queried whether this also breached human rights law, the Prime Minister accused them of being soft on terror.
We'll see where the shame lies, but in my judgment the shame will lie with the Conservative Party faced with legislation to prevent terrorism that are going to vote against it. If they want to vote against it, let them. We will be content, ultimately, to have the verdict of the country on it.
I have now shown how ministers have exploited terror for political point scoring, blame shifting and electoral advantage. Next, I will set out how government has misled us about the very nature of the threat we face.
We have demonstrated how some anti-terror policies are there to protect the government as much as to keep us safe.
Now let's examine how ministers made use of specific terrorist threats in order to pursue controversial policy objectives. Let's examine how government helped to fuel a media bandwagon and then exploited it for its own end.
Two months before the invasion of Iraq, police raided a house in North London and arrested 6 men. In a bedsit in the house, they found ingredients and recipes for making ricin, a deadly poison. The occupant of the bedsit, Kamel Bourgass, wasn't there. A week later, when he was arrested, Bourgass murdered a detective. After the first raid, Scotland Yard issued a press release to which the government's Deputy Chief Medical Officer also put her name. A small amount of the material has tested positive for the presence of ricin poison.
We were led to believe, collectively as the press, that this was the big one. This was the evidence that we had been sceptical about, that there was a genuine threat on our doorsteps from international Islamic terrorists.
The raid came as Britain and America were making their case to invade Iraq. A vital strand in that case was the assertion that Saddam Hussein was producing chemical weapons and passing that know-how to Al-Qaeda. Britain and America seized upon the ricin find as proof of Saddam's worldwide conspiracy, well before any of the evidence had been tested in the courts.
As the arrests that were made earlier today show, this danger is present and real and with us now, and its potential is huge.
Tony Blair, as a lawyer, clearly knew the effect that that would have on any fair trial, but nonetheless he chose to make it, and one can only assume that was with a view to make some political gain.
But the government claim that ricin had been found was false. These powerful statements from the Prime Minister and others were based on nothing more than a preliminary test that suggested ricin might be present. 2 days later, the government's Chemical Defence Centre at Porton Down carried out a definitive test to resolve the issue. Professor Alistair Hay is one of Britain's foremost experts on chemical weapons. Before the trial, he scrutinised the evidence.
This test is very specific for ricin. It will only react positively if ricin is present. And when the sample was tested, there was a negative result, and it clearly showed, therefore, that ricin was not present in that sample.
So, for all the assertions by police, press and politicians, there was no ricin. A month later, US Secretary of State Colin Powell put the case to the United Nations for the invasion of Iraq. Despite Porton Down's finding, he made the fictitious ricin crucial to his argument.
The plot also targeted Britain. When the British unearthed a cell there just last month, one British police officer was murdered during the disruption of the cell. Imagine a pinch of salt. Less than a pinch of ricin would cause shock followed by circulatory failure. Death comes within 72 hours.
What Colin Powell was talking about yesterday is correct. The poison factory in northern Iraq and the stuff that they are producing there, which includes ricin and other poisons, we believe has been dispersed throughout the world.
Almost everything Colin Powell had said and Tony Blair supported was wrong. No Al-Qaeda factory was ever found in Iraq, and ricin is not nearly as deadly as Colin Powell claimed. To be effective, ricin has to be injected, whereas Kamel Bourgass allegedly planned to smear his ricin on car door handles. Bourgass was no chemist, and his laboratory was a messy bedsit, and of course he never actually made any ricin. Apparently, in its eagerness to use the so-called ricin plot, the government hadn't checked with Porton Down to find out whether there really was any ricin, and Porton Down hadn't bothered to tell the government that there was no ricin until the very eve of the Iraq War. This incredible story only came to light at the trial when the liaison officer for Porton Down took the stand. He was cross-examined very closely about what the government really had known at the time when Colin Powell made his speech.
His evidence was, to say the least, contradictory. He indicated that he routinely and regularly made notes. When asked where those notes were and whether we could have them, he asked the court whether he could change his answer and say that he didn't make any notes. This was a surprise, to say the least.
So, as world leaders sexed up ricin, the man from Porton Down apparently sat on his hands.
He recalled seeing the widespread media coverage at the time. He was asked whether he thought that he should say something or to anybody about it, or to try and correct what was, even on his view, a misleading impression. His response that it wasn't his function to get involved in politics.
The absence of ricin was not made public until the trial almost 2 years later. The police claimed they couldn't reveal the truth, as by the time they were told, the information had become sub judice.
It's clear nonsense to suggest that it can be lawful to present information to the world which directly impacts on defendants, which is incorrect, yet unlawful to correct that information. It would be illegal nonsense.
At the trial, another false claim was laid to rest. The prosecution had alleged that Bourgass's recipe for ricin came from an Al-Qaeda poison manual, but the defence proved that it was devised by a survivalist crank, Kurt Saxon, noted ironically for his hatred of Islam.
Ricin is simply an albumin extracted from castor beans. I will show you what castor beans look like. See, they look like big bloated ticks.
Bourgass had copied Saxon's recipe from a Californian survivalist website. Eventually, Bourgass was convicted. All the other defendants were acquitted. Some of the jurors have said publicly they found the evidence against them very thin. Yet 5 months later, in September last year, on the very day the government published its anti-terror bill, 5 of the men found innocent in the ricin trial were rearrested by order of the Home Secretary.
Clearly what the government wanted to do was to say, right, here are our solutions to terrorism and the threat that we believe there is. Oh, look, this is an example of why you need to have this new anti-terrorist legislation brought into place. And clearly that is something that has been used by the government to try and push this information and this new legislation.
On the day that you published a terrorism bill, the 5 suspects who had been released in the ricin trial were rearrested. Can you assure me that was a pure coincidence?
I can't remember the exact order of events. The reason why that happened was because we had a terrorist threat that we had to deal with.
I was just noticing the extraordinary coincidence of events.
Yes, that's because you're a cynic. The timing of the publication of the terrorism bill and the question of the arrest of the people involved that you're describing were independent events. There was nothing that related them, and so it was indeed a coincidence.
This startling coincidence does raise some interesting questions. If these men really are dangerous terrorists, why were they allowed to walk free on British streets for a full 5 months after the collapse of the ricin trial? And how come the courts have now freed 2 of them and granted conditional bail to the other 3? The ricin trial provides powerful evidence of the way government ministers have deceived the British people over terror, but the media and sometimes the police are equally at fault.
Exhibit A is the fiendish plot to blow up Old Trafford on match day. There wasn't an iota of truth in this story, but that didn't prevent police sources from tipping off the press. Several national newspapers duly splashed on the story, and it made the lead item on ITV and Sky news bulletins.
In April 2004, over 400 police officers raided half a dozen properties in and around Manchester. They arrested 8 men, 1 woman and a 16-year-old boy.
Anyway, so you had been living
Osman
here for how
Fatah
long?
was one of 6 Iraqi Kurds arrested that day. He was staying in a house for refugees. He'd been there just 3 days.
This is the house, isn't
Yes,
it?
this is the house I was living there. I was asleep, and suddenly the police dragged me from my bed. So the police officer were pointing at me the guns, you know, had the light on the, and they were shouting, "Please, please, please!"
And did you think they might shoot you?
Yes, absolutely, yes.
So what did they say you had been arrested for?
One of the police officers told me, "You've been arrested under of terrorism act," and I was shocked.
Osman and a housemate were brought to Stretford police station. They'd be held and interrogated here for 9 days. But according to one of the defence lawyers, the police seemed to have no evidence to put to them.
I would expect to be told why my client had been arrested, what the reasonable suspicion was that he had to do with the offence. In this case, I was given no information of that type whatsoever. The questioning went on over days and days and days, but with no real substance to any of the questions. Why do you have an extension lead in your sitting room attached to the television? Questions which had a perfectly legitimate answer to them.
Manchester police have never explained why they made these arrests and refused to speak to us about the case. What we do know is that they found ticket stubs to a Manchester United game and a poster of Old Trafford at the flat of one of the young men. The accusation he was a terrorist frightens him so much he wants to remain anonymous. He told me how he explained to the police he'd been a Manchester United fan since his childhood back in Iraq.
They bring in the coffee and the guy, they ask me, "What do you like?" I say, "I like a football." "Oh, what do you support?" They ask me, "Just like a friendly." I say, "Manchester United." "Oh, how long you support Manchester United?" I said, "When I was child, when I was small, you know."
When you were in Kurdistan?
Yeah. Oh, they asked me, "Have you been football ground?" I said, "Of course I've been football ground 2 years ago, long time ago."
This tenuous football connection seems to have been the problem. It led Manchester police to tip off journalists that the suspects were plotting to bomb Old Trafford on match day. Some journalists were sceptical.
When the initial reports came out that Old Trafford was a target, we had no reason to believe that wasn't the case. But as soon as you started to make inquiries as a journalist, it became clear that this story was extremely flaky. The trouble is that because so little information is open to journalists on these issues, it is very tempting to run with the tiny piece of information that you have.
With rival channels leading on the Old Trafford story, the BBC correspondent faced pressure to follow suit. Attempting to stand the story up, she had called her intelligence service source.
I went to my editors and I said, "We have a problem here. I'm being told by a source I really, really trust that this may not be such a big deal and these guys may be released without charge." And my editor said, "Well, hang on a minute. Everyone else is reporting there's a great plot to bomb a Manchester United football match, and you're telling me these guys are going to be released. Some of the newspapers are leading on this story. Our rivals are running it as high as they possibly can. Manchester police are about to hold a press conference, and you're telling me play it down."
The press release the police issued before that conference did nothing to dampen the rumours. Greater Manchester Police and Manchester United Football Club have put in place extra security measures to reassure the public.
I couldn't believe the press releases that started to come out. To suggest that there had actually been heightened security put on that game runs into the problem of feeding the idea in the public imagination that there had been a threat in the first place. And there hadn't been.
As the media frenzy threatened to cause panic, the BBC correspondent received a highly unusual call from her source inside the intelligence services.
This is a contact who never phones me. I phone him, I ask him questions, he answers them. He does not offer information. He did something he's never done before or since. He phoned me and he said, "You're absolutely right. Manchester Police are about to hold a press conference. All I can say is I don't know why they're holding that press conference or what's going on, but I am telling you I believe these people will be released without charge."
Her contact was right. Despite the heightened security, there was no truth to the Old Trafford bomb plot. All the suspects were released with no charges against any of them. But the damage was done.
Actually, I lost my reputation that time. I lost my girlfriend. I lost a lot of friends. My best friend deleted my number on his phone because he was scared as well. Even my family, they don't believe me now. They still sometimes they ask me, "Why you?"
This false story grievously misled the public and damaged the lives and reputations of innocent young men who'd come to Britain seeking refuge. But few newspapers published corrections. And Manchester Police have refused to investigate the source of the leaks to the press.
I think there was no denying that the leak came from within the police service and that somebody within the police service had been briefing both about the raids, the football tickets, the possible implications and so on. I think it was accepted that this had been enormously damaging.
Damaging how and to who?
I think the wider public is given the impression that there was a plot to devastate a football ground carried out by Muslim extremists. That's the way it's seen by the public. That damages the view of the Muslim community in this country, and if it turns out to be completely untrue, well, that unfortunately doesn't get any coverage.
We have shown that you cannot believe a word you read in the newspapers about the terrorist threat. We have also shown that the politicians are only too ready to use terror as a political tool. Now it is time to ask a different question. Does this false and debased public discourse hinder ministers from making the complex and sensitive decisions which are fundamental to winning the fight against terror? Since coming to power, Tony Blair has been responsible for no fewer than 5 acts of Parliament combating terrorism. These new laws were mainly designed to detain those who pose a threat to us, and that is important. But we also need to get to the root of the terror problem.
I think there's been a big problem in the focus of government and political attention. Of course, we have needed new laws and new approaches to policing, no one would deny that, but the emphasis has been very strongly on getting the new laws in place and the tough messages about policing. You need at least as much, arguably far more effort in winning the arguments out there, in dealing with the problems that lead to alienation, in tackling the forces that are drawing young people into extremism.
Immediately after the London bombings, Tony Blair did invite Muslim leaders to give their views on how to prevent another catastrophe. But once again, spin was at work. At the meeting, the Prime Minister set up 7 working groups to investigate Islamic extremism. They'd meet all of 3 times and were given just 6 weeks to report back.
And let's just reflect on that. Find a solution for extremism and radicalisation in the Muslim community in the UK. That's a huge piece of work. It isn't something that can be tackled in the space of a month, 2 months. And I think that the whole process smacked to me a little bit of presenteeism, and to be seen to be doing something rather than actually really producing an effective and constructive piece of work.
When we were told what the deadlines were, we were taken aback. I mean, we spoke to one another and queried whether we were just being set up as a tokenistic exercise, because it didn't seem to me in the middle of August, when half the country is on holiday, that 2 or 3 meetings of a couple of hours each would set to right a host of intractable and difficult long-term problems.
Let me write to you what Haras Rafiq of the Muslim Working Parties said. It isn't something that can be tackled in the space of a month or 2 months. The whole process smacked to me a little bit of presentationalism. What do you make of that?
Well, fundamentally,
he's not the only person who said that.
His core point is right, that addressing this issue is not a matter for a month or 2 months. But what's important is you're seeking to address it, and as both institutions of the state as a whole and society and the Muslim community itself address it, that we have a clarity of direction.
But seeking clarity of direction did not extend to discussing whether Tony Blair's foreign policies had helped to turn British Muslims towards violence.
I drew the Prime Minister's attention to how the Muslim community had been alienated through the Iraq War, which I thought it was important to get him to sort of acknowledge that. He didn't acknowledge it. He moved on. I think it would be fair to say that that didn't go down terribly well.
The Muslim working groups were a cynical device. The Cabinet already had its own report on young Muslims and extremism. The government largely ignored it and refused to make it public, though copies did leak out. This report warned that Tony Blair's Iraq policy was a factor in drawing British Muslims towards terrorist activity.
I think there was a reluctance to accept that things were as bad as that report was saying. It set out a lot of the factors which were leading some young people into extremism. It included their sense of alienation. It included their concerns about foreign policy. It doesn't seem that a great deal was done in response to that report.
After the London bombings, Tony Blair repeatedly denied any link between them and the invasion of Iraq.
I have to say to the right honourable gentleman, it is a form of terrorism aimed at our way of life, not at any particular government or any particular policy.
The Prime Minister makes it worse when he denies that there is any link between British policy and the levels of anger which young Muslims feel in Britain, because it's perfectly obvious that that is just not the case. And it also gives the impression that there's a refusal to engage with these people in having a proper debate and simply turning our back on them and ignoring them.
There's an even more worrying point. Before the Iraq War, ministers pressured the intelligence services to justify invading Iraq. Are Britain's security services now feeling pressured to downplay how the Iraq factor has helped create British terrorists? A former insider believes that they are.
Even if the intelligence services, who are pragmatic people, are saying, well, look, the government's denying that, but we know it to be true, the man in the street knows it to be true, it makes it very difficult for intelligence officers or intelligence analysts to properly include the effect of Iraq as part of a radicalisation package in anything they do or say. The government doesn't allow it, which probably means that the senior people, the very senior people in our intelligence community are in some way compromised by it. So it can actually affect where we put our spooks, where we put our bugs, where we put our surveillance, and that's dangerous.
Last month, a leaked document from the Joint Terrorism Analysis Centre, known as JTAC, which reports directly to the head of MI5, revealed that we know disturbingly little about how the London bombings were planned.
A document like that would carry the highest classification, and it's a risky thing for anybody to do in JTAC. I mean, it's a criminal offence to do that, but it shows a number of things which are, I think, very interesting and significant. One is that elements of JTAC are deeply unhappy with the whole way that 7/7 has been dealt with and the whole progress of the investigation. There's something stirring within our intelligence community that at last, 7 months later, is beginning to work out that all is not as it should be and that they need to reform themselves, retrain themselves and redo their attitudes if they're going to be a serious force in the suppression of terror.
These legitimate questions about the effectiveness of the intelligence services lie behind the calls for an independent inquiry into the London bombings. This was also a key recommendation of the Muslim working groups.
At the culmination, we met the Home Secretary and several other ministers, and I asked again whether the Home Secretary was going to act on the recommendation of the working groups, which was to hold a public inquiry. And his answer to me was that he would reflect on it and discuss it with parliamentarians once we reconvened in Parliament. I haven't heard anything more since.
Any such inquiry would bring to light potentially embarrassing facts. The government has refused to hold one. It has confined itself to instructing a civil servant to write a so-called narrative of the events surrounding the London bombings.
Bad decision not to have a public inquiry. 7/7 and 21/7 remain essentially unexamined in the open. There's been no effort made whatsoever to conduct a detailed, pitiless forensic inquiry on how we can do better. And I think unless we learn those lessons, we're not going to close the vulnerabilities off. Therefore, by refusing to have a public inquiry, we are, in a sense, possibly further downstream, making ourselves more vulnerable to terror than we need to be.
The government has helped construct a false discourse on terror. Too often it's been motivated by narrow political calculation, and this when Britain faces the greatest terrorist threat in our history.
To fight it, ministers are asking that we should give up essential civil rights. To make that sacrifice, we must be able to trust them. The sadness is, they won't trust us. They won't trust us to judge their policies on their merits. They always have to spin it, and that just won't do, because we're all in this together.
Next on 4, the mother and doctors of a baby girl born with 2 heads tell the incredible story of her fight for life in Body Shock.